The good folk of Knightsbridge Baptist Church would have been rejoicing that the war had finished. They would have been very, very pleased indeed in terms of not opening up the morning papers anymore and going through the lists of the casualties, the wounded and the dead. But I think there would have been great sadness at the same time over those who had been wounded and those who had been killed. You know, sometimes as Christians, we get caught up in events that affect our community or our nation, events that are so much bigger than our own personal events. I think of things like widespread droughts, economic depressions, and of course, war. We don't control these events, and we are faced with how to respond to them as Christians. These events, these crises, raise many questions for us as Christians. And so will our response to them be the same as the response of those who do not follow Jesus? Where is God in the midst of these crises? Where is God in the middle of suffering? How can we serve in the way of Christ when we are faced with these crises, with these events that are beyond our control and often involve much suffering? The Great War, or the First World War, as it's also known, was from 1914 to 1918. And it was a war like the world had never seen before. It was the largest war in human history up to that point of time. And it involved many, many nations, including Australia. And Australians ended up fighting against Germans and Turks and Austrians and Hungarians. In one battle alone, the Battle of the Somme, there were 3 million combatants. And 1 million were either killed or wounded. One of those who was killed was Leonard Gurner, Lieutenant Leonard Gurner, who we see up in the stained glass window there. Another soldier from Knightsbridge, Eric Inglis, was severely wounded during the battle and was awarded the Military Cross for his bravery. Churches were affected too by the First World War. We were not apart from it. And here is a cathedral in Belgium, St. Martin's Cathedral, which was destroyed by the war. For Knightsbridge Baptist Church, there was not that type of destruction. But for the members of this church, there was suffering. There was anxiety. And the members of this church at this time supported each other in their suffering and in their anxiety. They had shared fellowship of suffering. And this morning, I want us to reflect on a few of the questions and situations that our forebears grappled with at the time of the First World War. And I hope as we explore these that it will help us respond faithfully as Christians to crises that are larger than our personal crises. It will enable us to better respond to the crisis of war if we should ever face that again. The first question that I want to address regarding the First World War is why our Christian forebears mostly supported the war effort through enlisting to serve overseas or encouraging men and women to do so. Women, of course, served as nurses and in other ways during the First World War. In the First World War, there was no conscription. Every person that went overseas to serve with the military went as a volunteer. And soon after the war broke out, there were recruiting meetings held. There were speakers, there were bands. You can see the British flag on display there, the Union Jack. And many responded to the calls to enlist. And of course, to support the war effort, there was more ways of doing that than simply serving overseas. And many at home, and members of Knightsbridge Baptist Church, prayed for those who served overseas. They sent biscuits. They knitted socks. They sent chocolates and other permissible foods. They wrote letters. They provided comfort to those who were anxious. 3 young men from Knightsbridge never returned home. Len Gurner, Lindsay Gadd, and John Siddell. And no doubt the folk of Knightsbridge Baptist Church rallied around them. In those days, pastors had the responsibility of delivering the telegram that brought bad news. And so the pastors at the time would have had that responsibility. Some people during the First World War feared a knock on the door from the pastor. And so some pastors actually put out in advance that if they were bringing bad news, they would be wearing a certain type of clothing because they didn't want people just to assume the worst as the pastor knocked on the door. Why did Baptists support the war efforts? Well, it's worth mentioning that widespread support from Baptists was not guaranteed because there had been strong opposition amongst many Baptists to the Boer War. Baptists were outspoken against militarism. They were outspoken about compulsory military training for young men. South Australian Baptists were even critical of the Boy Scout movement because they believed the Scout movement at that stage promoted war-like attitudes amongst boys. Baptists supported the idea of liberty of conscience, and so many opposed the idea of conscription. They didn't like the idea of people being forced to serve. This was all leading up to the First World War. So when war broke out, one minister who called himself pro-peace in a letter to the Baptist newspaper of the day, he wrote this: "From our pulpits, our young men are urged to lay down their lives for the country, which is not the first part of a soldier's duty. His duty is to lay down the other fellow's life. We have preached and philosophized on the cross and on the Sermon on the Mount, but we haven't dared practice and apply them. However, his voice proved to be a minority one. At the South Australian Baptist Annual Assembly in 1915, a resolution was passed which affirmed the righteousness of Britain's cause and expressed satisfaction that many young Baptists had already volunteered to serve with the military. The motion was carried enthusiastically, and those there sang the national anthem and gave 3 cheers for the British Empire and for the soldiers. For some, I think, the decision to serve with the military was a deeply principled decision, and it was made after much thought, the study of Scripture, and through prayer. They realized that war was no game, that war was a horrendous thing. They believed that war should not be the first resort, but the very last. But they believed that war was justified in the eyes of God to resist tyranny and to defend those who had suffered through invasion. They were horrified by German militarism of the day. When Germany had invaded Belgium, they believed that they had the responsibility to stand up against German military aggression. They believed in the righteousness of the cause of the British Empire. And of course, Australia was included in that. The Australian Baptist newspaper of the day warned against war fever and bitterness towards the German people. It encouraged prayerful dependence on God and looked forward to the triumph of universal peace made possible by a future federation of nations. However, there is no doubt that many Australians, including Baptists, were sometimes caught up in the propaganda of the day, where hate towards Germans was expressed, and young men were put under heavy emotional pressure to enlist. Just going to put up now some slides of posters of the day in this regard. The pressure reached its peak in 1916 and 1917 when there was a referendum to bring in conscription. But in the end, the no vote narrowly prevailed both times. The second question I want to raise this morning concerns the impact of the war on those at the front and at home. There is no doubt about the extraordinary bravery of many who fought in the face of frightening and horrifying circumstances. What of George McLean from Knightsbridge Baptist Church, who displayed extraordinary bravery during the Battle of Pozieres, who was in sole charge of a gun for 2 days in an exposed position and gave covering fire for working parties of the infantry. And he would run through barrage fire, bringing valuable information to his commanding officer. He won the Distinguished Conduct Medal, but ended up as a prisoner of war of the Germans. Then there was Elliot Inglis, another young man from Knightsbridge. He was a member of the Australian Flying Corps, and in France he flew SE-5A single fighter seat fighters, aircraft. And just to be in a machine like that, so flimsy, so exposed to artillery shells, so exposed to the bullets, it was a terrible thing to do. We're just going to pause. We're going to come back soon for part 2. The Reverend Fred Miles, an Australian Baptist chaplain to the troops in France, wrote of the horrors of war. A shell falls a few yards to your left and kills a few of your friends and wounds several of your comrades. They cannot be moved till nightfall, and their chums try to make them as roughly comfortable as they can. On the right, an exploding shell gives one man shell shock, while another falls dead as a result of the concussion. The shell-shocked man swings his arms to and fro, and he weeps like a child. In the middle of this, Christian chaplains and YMCA workers ministered as best they could. They shared the good news of the gospel. They prayed with those who were dying. They brought comfort where they could. They were involved in providing entertainment for the troops. Christian soldiers also did what they could as well. There are many stories coming out of the First World War of conversions of soldiers. One Baptist family by the name of Swift from the Edwardstown Baptist Church had 10 sons, 6 of whom enlisted, and I believe all returned home. But there was rejoicing in the Swift family when, after entering military service, one of the sons became a Christian. The faith of Christian soldiers was often tested by what they faced, but also sometimes by the skepticism and the irreligion of many Australian soldiers. One Baptist soldier from South Australia wrote, "There are few times when you can approach fellows on the subject of religion without it being ridiculed." But others, such as George McLean from Knightsbridge, came through with their faith strengthened. Upon his return to Adelaide after the war, he declared his intention of following the Supreme Commander, Jesus Christ, whom he had learned while away to trust and love more than ever. On the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month of 1918, an armistice was declared following a series of stunning defeats suffered by Germany and its allies. Over the following year, the troops began to come home on the troop ships. And here some are crossing the equator and celebrating crossing the equator on the way home. But not all were able to celebrate. Many lay buried in France, and their families grieved. The end of the war brought great relief to Australians, including the Baptists of South Australia. One local Baptist declared after the end of the war, "We have no longer to take up the morning papers with trembling hands, nor to dread the arrival of a telegram." Baptists gave thanks to God for victory in the war, and returning military personnel were welcomed home as heroes. But there were ongoing problems as well. Many soldiers came back with wounds, both physical and mental, and had difficulty fitting back into the routine of family life, of work, of civilian life. And the suffering brought through the First World War did not finish at war's end and lasted a lifetime for many. And here again, Knightsbridge Baptist Church folk are gathered around, and the stained glass window is just one indication of the love and support and that fellowship of suffering that occurred. But some Baptist leaders in South Australia wondered if they had been good shepherds of the flocks during the war and reassessed some of the things they had done and said. One leading campaigner for the First World War was Fred Norwood, who was minister at North Adelaide Baptist Church. After the war, he became a pacifist. He actually went on and became one of the leading pastors and ministers in Great Britain and had an international career, and regretted some of the things that he had said to young men, urging them to enlist. Many others felt absolutely that they were right in supporting the war effort. That was by far the majority opinion. But even there, that was tempered a little bit. In Mark's Gospel, chapter 8, Mark recounts for us the time when Jesus prayed for a blind man who was only partially healed. He could now see, sort of, but people looked like trees walking. So Jesus prayed for him a second time, and he was completely healed. Very soon after that, as we read in the same chapter of Mark, Jesus asked the apostle Peter who he thought he was. "You are the Christ," Peter replied. But when Jesus said Peter said that, Jesus said that Jesus must suffer and die. And he rebuked Peter, saying, because Peter had denied that Jesus must suffer. Peter, like the blind man, saw in part. He realized that Jesus was the Christ, but didn't quite grasp all that there was to Christ, that Christ would come and suffer on a cross and rise again. Some Baptist leaders in South Australia came to believe that although they got many things right concerning the First World War, they'd been too influenced by the enthusiastic nationalism and imperialism of the day. And so when the Second World War broke out, once again they supported the war effort, but were much more careful in some of the things that they were saying to the young men who were enlisting. Wars and crises require careful, prayerful and faithful response. Faithful response to each one of us to the voice of Jesus. As Peter found out, the wisdom and way of Jesus was so much more than what he could conceive, and ultimately so much more wonderful. We acknowledge the heroism of those from Knightsbridge Baptist who served. We acknowledge the way that the whole community gathered and supported each other, a fellowship of suffering. But there were lessons to be learned in all of this. And as we stay close to Jesus Christ, as we are determined to be faithful to him, then Jesus will guide us in the ways that he wants us to take when we are faced with major crises or wars in the future. Amen.